Destiny is not a map drawn for you, but a trail you must blaze yourself. The greatest treasures are found not at the start, but in the truths discovered on the path. The dust of Fort Worth settled on Silas's buckskin jacket like a second skin. He stood before Josiah Worthington, a man whose wealth couldn't hide the disdain in his eyes. The banker's office was opulent, a stark contrast to the world Silas knew. "Find my Caroline," Worthington commanded, his voice sharp and dismissive. "She has been abducted." Silas felt the familiar sting of prejudice, but the weight of the gold offered was a cold, hard fact. He accepted the contract, his face an unreadable mask of stone, his mind already on the trail ahead. Worthington slid a portrait across the polished mahogany desk. Caroline's face, pale and serene, stared up at Silas. "She is a delicate flower, unsuited for this savage land." The implication was clear, a jab at the Comanche blood that flowed in Silas's veins. He ignored the slight, focusing on the details. The money would buy him a small piece of land, a place where he could finally escape the judgment of men like Worthington. It was a dream he clung to, a fragile hope in a harsh world. "The reward is substantial," the banker added. Back on the bustling street, Silas gathered his supplies. The whispers followed him from the general store to the livery. He felt the weight of their stares, the fear and hatred directed at the man who was neither fully white nor fully accepted by the tribe of his mother. Each hostile glance fueled the cold resolve in his heart. He was an outsider, a ghost walking between two worlds. This journey was just another path he would walk alone, with only his horse and his rifle for company. He moved with a quiet efficiency that unnerved the townsfolk. At the edge of town, where civilization frayed into endless prairie, Silas knelt. His eyes, a gift from his Comanche mother, scanned the ground. He found it almost immediately. The faint tracks of a carriage, heading north toward the Wichita Mountains. A subtle sign, missed by the local lawmen. The trail was faint, but for him it was a clear path. The promise of gold was a hollow comfort against the vast emptiness of the plains, and the deeper emptiness within him. He mounted his horse, a solitary figure against the setting sun. For days, Silas rode through the unforgiving terrain. The sun beat down, and the wind whispered secrets only he could understand. The trail led him deep into the Wichita Mountains, a jagged spine of rock and shadow that tested his endurance. He moved with a purpose that bordered on obsession, his senses sharp, every broken twig and displaced stone a word in a language he knew intimately. He was closing in. He could feel it in the air, a tension that hummed just beneath the silence of the wilderness. The mountains held their breath as he advanced. He found their camp nestled in a hidden valley, shielded by ancient cottonwoods. The scent of wood smoke and roasting meat hung in the air. This was the lair of the Hargrove brothers, a place few men could find. Silas dismounted, tethering his horse in a grove of cedars. He moved like a ghost, through the underbrush, his footfalls silent on the dry earth. His hand rested on the hilt of his hunting knife. He expected to find a frightened girl, a prize to be claimed. He crept closer to the flickering light of the campfire, preparing for a confrontation. What he saw stopped him cold. A woman stood in the firelight, but she was no weeping captive. It was Caroline Worthington, her fine dress replaced with practical buckskins. She held a Winchester rifle with a steady hand, aiming at a distant target. A man with a charming smile, whom Silas presumed was Gentleman Jack Hargrove, offered quiet instruction. Then she fired, and a genuine, unburdened laugh echoed through the valley as the tin can flew into the air. Her entire demeanor spoke not of fear, but of a newfound, untamed freedom. From the darkness of the trees, Silas watched, his world tilting on its axis. The serene face from the portrait was gone, replaced by a vibrant, confident woman who was clearly no victim. She was a willing participant in this life, a fact that twisted his mission into a complicated knot. A wave of confusion washed over him, mixed with an unwilling spark of admiration for her spirit. This changed everything. His contract was to rescue a kidnapped heiress, not to drag a willing runaway back to a life she had chosen to flee. Silas decided the direct approach was the only way. He stepped out of the tree line, hands kept deliberately away from his weapons, and walked toward the campfire. "Just a man looking for honest work," he said, his voice calm and even, addressing no one in particular. His mixed heritage, often a source of scorn, now served as his best disguise. A man caught between worlds would naturally be a wanderer. The outlaws fell silent, their eyes sizing him up, their initial welcome a wall of hard-faced suspicion. Gentleman Jack watched with a calculating smile. A hulking man with a mean-spirited glint in his eye, whom Silas identified as Abe Hargrove, spat on the ground. "We ain't hirin'." He stepped forward, a clear threat. But Silas didn't flinch. He simply met the man's hostile gaze. "I can track, hunt, and handle a blade. I earn my keep." Jack intervened with a smooth gesture. "Hold on, Abe. Let's see what the man can do." He saw not a threat, but a potential asset. Silas's quiet confidence had won him a dangerous, temporary reprieve around their fire. From across the camp, Caroline watched the newcomer with a guarded curiosity. He was not like the others. There was a stillness about him, a coiled intensity that the loud bravado of the Hargrove gang lacked. He called himself a drifter, but his eyes were too sharp, his movements too precise. They were the eyes of a predator, not a vagrant. She felt a shiver of suspicion, a sense that his arrival was no mere coincidence. He was a puzzle she felt a compelling, and perhaps foolish, need to solve. Later, during the sparse meal, the camp was filled with rough laughter, but Silas sat apart, a silent observer. He felt her eyes on him and looked up, meeting her gaze across the flickering flames. For a long moment, a silent conversation passed between them, full of unasked questions, warnings, and a spark of dangerous attraction. He saw the sharp intelligence and fiery spirit her father had so desperately tried to smother. She was no damsel, and he was beginning to feel he was no longer a simple bounty hunter. The camp was quiet, save for the crackle of the dying fire and the snores of sleeping men. Caroline found him at the periphery, staring into the moon-drenched landscape. "You're not one of them," she said, her voice a soft murmur that didn't startle him. He turned his head slightly, acknowledging her presence without looking at her directly. "What makes you say that?" he asked, his tone low and resonant. "You watch, you listen. You don't belong here any more than I do." A fragile truce hung in the cool night air between them. "My father," she began, her voice tight with resentment, "arranged for me to marry a man twice my age, a man with cold hands and a colder heart. It was a business deal, not a marriage." She looked away, towards the dark hills. "Jack promised me freedom, a life where I made my own choices, under the wide-open sky, not in a gilded cage." Her words were a torrent, a confession held back for too long. "For a time, I believed him. It felt like my only escape from a life that was already a prison. He never saw me as a daughter," she continued, the bitterness sharp in her voice. "I was an asset, a piece on his chessboard to be moved and sacrificed for his ambition." Her pain was a raw, open wound, and it resonated with a deep chord in Silas. He knew what it felt like to be valued only for your use, to have your identity erased by someone else's greed. He saw his own reflection in her story, the same loneliness and the same quiet fight for a place in a world that sought to define him. He finally turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "I have to tell you the truth. My name is Silas, and your father hired me to bring you back." The words hung between them, heavy and dangerous. He saw the trust in her eyes flicker and die, replaced by a flash of betrayal. "But why tell me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Because," he said, his gaze unwavering, "hearing your story, I believed you deserved to know who I was." His honesty became a fragile bridge over the chasm of his deception. In his Fort Worth office, Josiah Worthington paced like a caged tiger. Weeks had passed with no word from Silas. The silence frayed his nerves. He cursed his decision to hire the bounty hunter. A man of mixed blood was untrustworthy, his loyalties divided. Worthington imagined his daughter corrupted by the wilderness, his family name tarnished forever. His anxiety curdled into a cold, calculated fury. He had been a fool to rely on one outsider. It was time to unleash a more definitive and brutal solution to his problem. Captain Gideon Rourke entered the office with the chilling stillness of a serpent. He was a man forged in the crucible of war, his face a mask of disciplined indifference. His eyes were pale chips of ice. He stood before the banker, flanked by two men who mirrored his cold demeanor. They were ex-Confederate soldiers, men who followed orders without question and killed without remorse. "You have a task for us, Mr. Worthington?" Rourke's voice was devoid of emotion, a flat, dangerous instrument. Worthington felt a tremor of fear, but his desperation was greater. "The bounty hunter has failed," Worthington declared, his voice trembling with rage. "I want my daughter back, Captain, and I want this entire affair erased." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with malice. "There can be no witnesses. Not the outlaws who took her, and not the man I sent to find her. Am I clear?" The true motive was no longer paternal concern. It was damage control. Caroline and Silas knew too much, and for Josiah Worthington, some secrets were worth more than a daughter's life. "Their silence is paramount," he hissed. Rourke accepted the terms with a curt nod. There was no negotiation, only a quiet understanding of the task's bloody nature. He and his men rode out of Fort Worth not as a posse, but as a scalpel, ready to excise a problem. They moved with the grim efficiency of a military unit, their gear maintained, their expressions hard. They were a different breed of hunter, methodical and relentless. A far deadlier threat than the Hargrove gang was now on the trail, a storm of cold steel and calculated violence bearing down on the unsuspecting camp. Silas watched as the veneer of Gentleman Jack's charm began to crack. In unguarded moments, his easy smile would tighten, his orders to Caroline laced with the same possessive authority she had fled. Silas saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes, the slow, dawning horror that she had merely traded one cage for another, more rugged one. The promised freedom was an illusion, a mirage in the harsh light of reality. He saw her laughter become more forced, her gaze often drifting to the horizon, as if searching for an escape she hadn't yet imagined. The tension snapped during a poker game. Jack, losing a significant pot, slammed his cards on the makeshift table. "Caroline, fetch me another drink," he commanded, his voice hard. She hesitated, her jaw tightening. "You have hands of your own, Jack." The camp went silent. Jack's face flushed with anger. He grabbed her wrist, his grip tight. "When I tell you to do something, you do it. You belong to me now." The words hung in the air, ugly and undeniable, stripping away any pretense of partnership or romance. Before the situation could escalate, Silas shifted, the movement almost imperceptible. He began cleaning a hunting knife, the soft scrape of steel on whetstone cutting through the thick silence. He didn't look up, but his focus was absolute. "A man who has to remind others what he owns," Silas said softly, to no one in particular, "is a man who's already lost it." Jack released Caroline's wrist as if burned. Only Abe Hargrove seemed to understand the lethal promise in Silas's quiet tone, and his eyes narrowed with a new, deeper hatred. The final illusion shattered during a stagecoach robbery. The reality was not a daring adventure, but a brutal, terrifying affair. Caroline watched in horror as the gang terrorized the passengers, their romance turning to dust before her eyes. This wasn't freedom, it was cruelty. Later, as the gang celebrated their spoils, she sought out Silas's quiet presence. His steady calmness was an anchor in her sea of doubt. In his silence, she found a sense of justice and honor that Gentleman Jack's world utterly lacked, and she knew her choice had been a terrible mistake. The attack came with the first light of dawn, a brutal symphony of rifle fire that ripped through the sleeping camp. It was not the clumsy raid of bandits, but the cold, disciplined assault of soldiers. Captain Rourke's men moved with chilling efficiency, their shots precise, their advance relentless. The Hargrove gang, caught completely by surprise, scrambled for cover, their disorganized defense crumbling under the professional onslaught. Chaos erupted, the air filled with the sharp crack of gunfire and the shouts of dying men. In the heart of the mayhem, gentlemen, Jack's charm evaporated, revealing the coward beneath. With Rourke's men closing in, he grabbed Caroline, pulling her in front of him. "Don't shoot, I have the girl," he screamed, his voice shrill with panic. He tried to use her as a shield, a bargaining chip for his own worthless life. Caroline stared at him, her face a mask of shock and disgust. The man who had promised her freedom was ready to sacrifice her for his own survival. In that single ugly moment, her final illusion died. Silas saw the betrayal from his position behind a rock outcropping. He acted on pure instinct. A mercenary took aim at Jack and Caroline, and Silas's rifle fired a heartbeat sooner. As the soldier fell, Silas lunged forward, not to save Jack, but her. He slammed his shoulder into the outlaw leader, sending him staggering away from Caroline. "Get down!" Silas yelled, shoving her toward the cover of a fallen wagon. The bond of the contract was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective instinct he didn't fully understand. Freed from Jack's grasp, Caroline didn't cower. Her fear hardened into resolve. She snatched up a fallen outlaw's rifle, her movements surprisingly steady. She and Silas exchanged a single, potent glance. No words were needed. Back to back, they began to fight, moving with an instinctive coordination. They were no longer hunter and prey. In the smoke and chaos, surrounded by enemies on all sides, they were simply two people bound by a sudden, desperate alliance, their survival now completely entwined in a deadly dance. They fled the carnage, melting into the rugged folds of the Badlands. Behind them, the sounds of the firefight faded, replaced by the howl of the wind. They moved quickly, driven by adrenaline, leaving the bodies of outlaws and mercenaries to the vultures. Captain Rourke's men were relentless, and Silas knew they would be on their trail as soon as the battle was won. The landscape around them was unforgiving, a maze of canyons and rock spires that offered shelter but no real safety. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every gust of wind a warning. A glint of light on a high ridge gave Silas a split second of warning. "Down!" he yelled, shoving Caroline behind a boulder. The crack of a rifle echoed a moment later, and a searing pain tore through his shoulder. A sniper. He had taken the bullet meant for her. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he returned fire, not aiming to hit, but to force the shooter into cover. It gave them the precious seconds they needed. He stumbled, his strength beginning to fail, leaning on her for support as they scrambled deeper into the wilderness. She led him to a hidden cave, its mouth obscured by a curtain of ancient roots. Inside, the air was cool and still. With a determined look, she tore a strip from her petticoat and began to clean his wound. Her touch was gentle but firm, her movements surprisingly skilled. For the first time, Silas was completely vulnerable, forced to rely on her care. He watched her face, etched with concern, and saw not the banker's daughter, but a woman of immense strength and compassion. The pain in his shoulder was nothing compared to the unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest. As a storm broke outside, trapping them in the cave, the last of their defenses crumbled. They shared stories in the flickering firelight, he of a lonely childhood between two worlds, she of a gilded cage that stifled her soul. They spoke of solitude, of prejudice, of the yearning for a place to belong. In their shared vulnerability, they found a profound connection, a sense of understanding that neither had ever known. The world outside was hostile and dangerous, but within the small, safe space of the cave, they were no longer alone. Silas led her to a place his people called Ghost Canyon, a sacred labyrinth of rock and wind. The canyon walls played tricks with sound and shadow, a natural fortress for those who understood its secrets. "This land knows me," he told her, his voice low. "It will confuse them. Hide us." He began to plan, his mind a map of traps and ambushes. Caroline watched him, her fear replaced by a steely resolve. "I won't be the person they hide behind," she said, her grip firm on her rifle. "Teach me how to fight with this place, Silas." He showed her how the wind carried sounds, how a rock slide could be triggered with a single, well-placed shot. She proved to be a quick study, her senses sharp, her aim true. As they prepared, Silas found a second set of tracks leading into the canyon, heavy, clumsy, and filled with rage. Not the disciplined steps of Rourke's men. "Abe Hargrove," he said grimly, his eyes scanning the rocks above. He survived the attack. They were no longer just evading hunters. They were now caught between calculated malice and blind vengeance. In the tense silence before dawn, as they waited for their enemies to arrive, Silas pressed a small object into her hand. It was a bird carved from smooth, dark wood, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. "It is a symbol of freedom among my mother's people," he whispered. "The power to choose your own sky." Caroline closed her fingers around the small totem, its warmth a comfort against her skin. She looked at him, and in the dim light, their shared gaze was a more profound confession than any words could ever be. Rourke's men entered the canyon cautiously, but the echoing landscape immediately sowed confusion. A single shot fired by Silas sounded like a dozen, coming from all directions at once. Caroline, hidden in a high alcove, held her breath. She saw a mercenary trying to get a clear line of sight on Silas's position. Remembering his lesson, she aimed, squeezed the trigger, and the man fell. Just then, a furious roar echoed from the other end of the canyon. Abe. They were now trapped, the final, desperate battle about to begin. And the canyon descended into a maelstrom of calculated chaos. Silas used his knowledge of the terrain, turning the echoing walls into a weapon. He was a ghost, firing and vanishing, leading Rourke's men into dead ends and rockfalls. Caroline, from her perch, acted as his eyes, her rifle cracking with newfound precision. She was no longer a liability, but a vital part of their defense, her shots pinning down mercenaries and giving Silas the moments he needed to move. They fought as a single, coordinated entity, a seamless blend of his wilderness skills and her sharp intellect. Abe Hargrove, blinded by rage, charged into the fray, his fury making him a danger to everyone. He saw only Silas, his brother's killer, in his eyes. In a moment of madness, he attacked one of Rourke's own men, mistaking him for Silas in the shifting shadows. This act of frantic betrayal caused a fatal fracture in the mercenaries' discipline. While they were distracted, Silas made his move, disarming another soldier with swift, non-lethal efficiency. The professional hunters were being dismantled not by force, but by the canyon's illusions and their own fracturing trust. The final confrontation was not a shootout, but a battle of wits. Silas cornered a terrified Rourke, not with a weapon, but with a choice. He revealed an escape route only he knew. "Your men are broken. Your contract is worthless. Live to fight another day or die here for a liar's pride." Rourke, a pragmatist to the end, saw the truth in Silas's words and vanished into the rocks. As he fled, Abe made his final, desperate lunge at Silas, but Silas didn't meet his charge with violence. He simply stepped aside, and Abe's own momentum carried him over a steep ledge. When the dust settled, silence returned to Ghost Canyon. They stood together on a high ridge, watching the sun set over the vast plains. The contract was void, their enemies defeated. The past was a landscape of ghosts behind them, but the horizon ahead was a clean, unmarked canvas. Silas looked at Caroline, no longer seeing the banker's daughter he was hired to find, but an equal, a partner forged in fire and loyalty. He knew then that his hunt had led him to a treasure far greater than any gold, a future he would not have to face alone. Months had passed since the echoes of gunfire faded from Ghost Canyon. The harsh winds of the Badlands had given way to the gentle breezes of a secluded valley nestled in the shadow of the Colorado mountains. Here, the air was clean, the water was clear, and the land was unclaimed. It was here that Silas and Caroline chose to build their new horizon. The beginnings of a small, sturdy cabin stood near a babbling creek, the scent of fresh-cut pine mingling with the smell of wildflowers. They worked from sunrise to sunset, their movements a quiet, practiced rhythm of two people who had learned to rely on each other completely. One evening, as the sky bled into hues of orange and purple, they sat on a felled log, watching the first stars appear. Caroline traced the grain of the wood with her finger. "Did you ever think," she began, her voice soft, "that your life as a hunter would lead you to become a builder?" Silas looked at his hands, no longer just the hands of a tracker who took lives, but of a man who was shaping a home. "The gold I was hunting, it feels like a lifetime ago." A different man's prize. He turned his gaze to her, the firelight dancing in his eyes. "I spent my life moving between worlds, belonging to none. I thought what I wanted was a piece of land to be alone on. I was wrong. I was looking for a place, not just land. She reached out and took his hand, her grip firm and sure. "And my father," she said, a note of distant pity in her voice rather than anger. "He will spend the rest of his days protecting his reputation in a city of walls. He is trapped in a prison of his own making." She looked around at the vast, open valley, at their half-finished home. "And I am free." Inside the cabin, on the rough-hewn mantelpiece above the stone fireplace they had built together, sat the small wooden bird. It was a constant reminder of their journey, a symbol of the freedom they had fought for and won. They were no longer just the bounty hunter and the banker's daughter. They were homesteaders, partners. As darkness settled over their valley, they sat in comfortable silence. Two solitary souls who had found their place not on a map, but in each other. The future was still unwritten, a vast territory waiting to be explored, but they would face it together.